Hi, everyone, and welcome to the Meet Your Mentor podcast. The Meet Your Mentor podcast is a podcast where I, the host, will interview a mentor to learn a little bit about their journeys and their job, maybe asking about some advice they might have for listeners, what it means to be a mentor, and so much more. Now, my name is Alcee, and as I said earlier, I am the host of Meet Your Mentor. I'm a junior in high school, and I am an intern here at the Mentor Project. Before I get started and introduce you all to today's mentor, I just want to give a quick shout out to all of you and all of the sponsors. You guys keep this podcast running, and we really appreciate you guys. Now, I think you will love what I have in store for you today. Today, I get to interview Michael Alcee, a clinical psychologist from New York. He is a mental health educator at Manhattan School of Music, and Michael even won the American Psychological Association's 2019 Schillinger Prize, Memorial Prize, for an essay on the link between jazz and psychoanalysis. I'm very eager to learn more about what he found in his research. He also has an upcoming book called Therapeutic Improvisation: Stop Winging It and Start Owning It as a Therapist. Some of his other writings can be found in the Chicago Tribune, NPR, the TEDx stage, and more. So, Michael, I'm very excited to have you here today.
It's great to be here, Elise. I'm looking forward to our conversation.
Yeah. So just to get started, why don't you tell us a little bit about what it means to be a clinical psychologist?
Yeah, I think one of the great things about being a clinical psychologist is you're always working with stories every day. You're working with understanding people's feelings and their thoughts that are always wrapped in narrative. And what I love about it is it's always shifting. And the reason I wrote this book about improvisation is that I think as psychologists, we're always improvising. And I think as people, we're always improvising, trying to figure out how we're changing from one state to another. You know, you find yourself in the middle of the day feeling one thing, and then by the end, you're feeling something totally different, or even in the same hour. And it's sort of how we're built, and how to work with that artfully and mindfully, I think, is what's interesting about therapy and living. So one of the things I love about being a psychologist is it's very scientific. We get to understand how people work and why they think the way they do and how feelings come about. But it's also very artistic in that we're always figuring out how to make stories about ourselves and the world to make it more meaningful and purposeful.
Mm-hmm. Wow, that's like an insightful kind of approach that I haven't really heard before. So that was pretty interesting. I do have a question though. Have you, I'm guessing you can kind of go into this more, but it kind of like you wanting to be a psychologist kind of probably spurred from like loving to talk to people and that kind of thing. But was this something you kind of knew from when you were younger, or was it something where, you know, like you got out of high school and you were like, oh, this is kind of something that I want to do?
Yeah, it's a really good question. I sort of ran away from it. So my mother was a social worker growing up, and all throughout my childhood, we'd talk about books and the characters in books and movies as if they were our friends. And so I learned to see people as works of art and to see experiences as dilemmas that you experience with all the great characters of literature. And I also saw the way that she, would talk about the work that she did with clients, and saw how meaningful it was, that they weren't just like clients, they were like people she loved and cared for and rooted for. And so for me, it was always this interesting thing about working with people was something that was in my DNA. But when I was in college, I tried to move away from it and tried to be a bio major instead of, I was a psychology major, but I tried to be a bio major to get into the hard sciences. And eventually I did an internship, and it was working with juvenile delinquent boys. And I found that the time just flew and I forgot about what I was doing. And that's when I realized this is what I really am meant to do. And this is where time feels timeless. And I think, for anybody going into whatever career, you should feel like you're losing time. You should feel like you're in a moment where you get so totally immersed in it that you forget where you are. And then hopefully as you go along in whatever your career is, there's a great poet by the name of Billy Collins. He was the poet laureate. And he said, good poetry is like that old eye chart. It should be like a big E that's easy to see in the beginning, but as you keep on going down, you should get some mystery and maybe discover something new as you go. And I think a good career should be a career that's meant for you, is something that in some ways, when you look back at it, is totally obvious, but is also some way you find yourself getting there in a way you didn't expect.
Mm-hmm. That's a very I'm going to say beautiful. You kind of illustrated that very well in my mind. So that was pretty interesting. I definitely agree with I kind of resonate with when you said, that was something where time felt like timeless, and I feel like that's how you know that your passion is truly kind of what you want to do. Right. So.
But like I said, running away from it is also something interesting as well. And I think we do find that we run away or maybe move away from what is right for us. But I think if we're in tune with who we actually are, we'll come back in some way. And maybe, the other thing is, as you probably know about my background, I work in Manhattan School of Music as well. And I studied piano as a kid, and I never thought that particular interest would come into my work.
Yeah.
So I think, hopefully your career is also a manifestation of who you are in your fullness and your uniqueness.
Yeah. Yeah. I also kind of think it's interesting that you mentioned kind of turning away from this path before having to come back to it, because I feel like out of my time at the Mentor Project and interviewing lots of different mentors, that's kind of a common theme that I've noticed, where people, it's not like they have a set path from when they're really young, which, yes, that can happen for some people. But for most people, it kind of is a roundabout way of getting there. And you go through lots of different experiences before you end up in that one thing that you want to do for the rest of your life, So.
Yeah, there's something about, I think, having choice that's important. And I think there's a part of us that all kind of tries to rebel against what we feel we either should do or what others think we should do. And I think there's something about becoming our own kind of artist selves and in choosing that. And I think that there's a little bit of mischief in that. And I think it's also important to go through some struggle. I mean, if you look at Joseph Campbell, the great mythology expert, the hero has a journey by leaving home first and going away from the familiar. And so I think when we look at something that really has an arc in terms of a story, if you think of your career path as a hero journey, you should move away from home before you return home.
Yeah. Yeah. I like how, I can tell that kind of ties back to what you said about growing up, and you and your mom always kind of thought of characters and people. And I like how that kind of all merged together, and I studied the hero's journey a few years back. So I definitely kind of understand what you're saying with that, but that's really cool.
Yeah.
Yeah. I know you mentioned before, you work at the Manhattan School of Music, and I was wondering if you could talk a little bit more about kind of what got you there. I know you said piano, and that kind of came back into your job, or just, could you talk a little bit about what it is exactly that you do there?
Yeah. There was an old artist named Bob Ross. It's before your time and almost a little before my time too, but he used to paint on this PBS show, and he used to joke around about happy accidents.
Yeah.
And that he'd stumble upon a shack in the middle of this beautiful landscape, and all of a sudden it was a happy accident, or a tree. And I think going to Manhattan School of Music was a happy accident. I decided that I wanted to get out of full-time college counseling work because I was having our child, my son, and I wanted to have more time to be a father that was really present. And so when I left, I wanted to do private practice, and I stumbled upon this part-time gig. And I didn't plan it. I didn't expect it. The universe just made it appear. And it seems so perfect because I get to do therapy and also talk to people who are musicians and artists, which is something that I've always loved. And it got me out of the house. So I had this nice balance where I wasn't just at home doing private practice. So it really was a happy accident. It really was sort of serendipitous. And I think sometimes it's important that we sometimes leave things that we think are great for us in some ways, but they might be limiting in others. So I could have stayed in a full-time job with a 401k with vacation days and stayed for that my whole life. But I left because I had this feeling that, sort of like that old talk about if you build it, they will come. And I think sometimes, contracting a little bit and not knowing where you are helps these other experiences come up.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Which is, I think, the funny part about our career paths is like, I think one of the things that mentors, I think, help us do is to learn how to become comfortable with not knowing a bit more. Because we easily go to a place where we feel it's just uncertainty and ambiguity that's bad. But those are also the places where possibility and unfolding occur as well.
Yeah.
And by leaving my job that was secure, I found this other gig that brought me so much more. And then I also started to write. I was never a writer before. I mean, I always liked writing, but I started blogging and did a TEDx talk and worked on this book because I left this other thing that was much more familiar.
Yeah, that's really cool how that like kind of impacted other areas almost of your life that, wouldn't have happened otherwise. Yeah. I feel obliged to mention that I have done my fair share of like Bob Ross tutorial paintings. That was
Haven't we all?
right. Yeah, he's great. That was a little bit off topic, but I did want to ask, what is the age range of people that you're like working with at the Manhattan School of Music?
Yeah, so I work with conservatory students who are primarily undergraduate and graduate age.
Okay.
So anywhere from about 18 and they could go into their mid-20s, late 20s, early 30s.
Okay.
So everything that you'd expect in like a college graduate setting. So it's great. And the other thing that's neat about it too is that, I work with a diverse group because people who come to a conservatory are from all different states in the United States and also all different countries. So I'll work with people from China and Russia and Poland and, Washington State and Missouri and, you name it. And and the other thing is it's nice, you work with instrumentalists like pianists and violinists and then vocalists, opera, musical theater. I like to think that, I always joke to my students that all that I ask is that, one day I get box seats at the Met or maybe special seats to your Broadway show. Like, that's all.
Yep. Not too big now.
Not too much. Not too much. Yeah.
Not at all. Yeah. That's very cool. So I know I mentioned in like the little like podcast intro that I usually ask mentors about like advice for people. And for you, that kind of takes on a different meaning than most. But do you have any advice on, you can kind of pick or you can answer both, but advice for somebody who thinks they might be interested in psychology and kind of wants to end up where it's in a similar area to where you are, or on another kind of facet, like advice just for someone and who might be struggling right now and ways to kind of make sure you stay mentally healthy?
Yeah, I'll see if I can answer both. So I think for those interested in psychology, I think what's cool about psychology it's relatively broad. There's so many different places you can go with it, right? You could do therapy and counseling. You could do psychological testing, which is much more structured and, you don't stay with the person for months at a time. You could do research, you could teach. So the thing about psychology that I think unites psychology is the idea of a certain curiosity about how people work emotionally, intellectually. You could also work with so many different range, populations. You could work with adults, you can work with kids, you could work with older adults, you can work with a specialty area like eating disorders. So I think one of the things is just to recognize that psychology has a lot of diversity within it. And it's important to figure out, I think, what fits most with areas that you're intrigued by, also sometimes what fits with your personality and what fits with your sensibility. There are some people who think it's fantastic to have conversations with people that are going to last weeks at a time, delving into stuff. There's other people who like, that seems like too much pressure. Or I feel like I'd burn out, and maybe they'd prefer to do research where they're a few steps removed. Or maybe they'd rather being in front of a classroom. So I think it's important to just recognize that psychology is really vast and really interesting. And in terms of advice for people with careers is, or if you have apprehensions, I think first of all, it's really important to know that if you don't have apprehensions about your career, I'm actually more worried about you.
Yeah.
Because we spent so much time in our jobs. In fact, we probably spend as much, if not more time with our jobs than sometimes even with our families, if you look at it. So it's a pretty important thing, and it's a pretty important expression of what our values are and who we are in this particular culture. I think that's important, but I think it's also important to recognize that it's not all we are. And that hopefully we bring to our careers aspects of our personal lives that are important, and also we mix up our lives and balance our lives out so that our career isn't our end all and be all. So I think it's kind of trying to figure out how to balance both. And that sounds really tricky, and it is really tricky. I think the other thing that I think is really important for people who are just starting out is to remember that the culture has changed so much that people change jobs all the time now. And that because of startup culture and the way the economy works is that you don't have to feel like you have to have this detailed script from when you were born. In fact, there's a great book by David Epstein called Range. And it's about, what's the title? I have it over here. Range. Why generalists triumph in a specialized world. And he contrasts Roger Federer with Tiger Woods. And we often have this notion in our culture still that in order to be successful, you need to be specialized from when you're right out of the womb.
Yeah.
And that if you're not like putting by the time you're 2 years old, you're never going to be a great golfer. But Roger Federer started tennis a little later and did other sports, and it enabled him to have range. And he also seems to have a lot of range emotionally as well.
Mm-hmm.
So I think it's important to recognize that it's actually a good thing to have range, and that we don't have to worry about being so specialized. And we might actually take experiences that we think are going to be totally irrelevant, like my music background, or Ronald Reagan was a president of the United States, but he was a B-level movie actor before he became president, and he was president of the unions. He used that union in Hollywood. He used that union negotiating skill to broker deals in the Cold War.
Yeah.
Nobody ever would have thought that would have been relevant.
Mm-hmm.
And so you will take your collection of unique experiences and bring it with you everywhere and anywhere you go. So I think if that can allay some of your anxiety that you have to have it all figured out, sometimes we don't really know the full story until we've read it backwards.
Yeah. Yeah. That's really interesting. That sounds like a good book to read. I'll definitely have to check it out some more. It sounds really interesting. But
yeah.
Well, I mean, thank you for that perspective. I definitely agree. I feel like, you kind of hear the word psychology and you're just like, oh, it's very basic, but kind of the more you get into it, there's so many different areas, I always have kind of considered psychology to be one of my interests, but you could go in so many different directions. It's not one path, and I feel like most jobs are kind of that way in most fields. It's not just going to be a straight path. You have options,
Right. And I think that's the other thing is that we tend to pigeonhole lots of different subjects. And I think that I think the best take home is that there's diversity within everything if we have an eye for it.
Yeah. Yeah, definitely. This is on a separate note, but I know I mentioned your essay that is on the link between jazz and psychoanalysis. And I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about either your findings or kind of why you wanted to do it in the first place.
Yeah, so there was this essay contest about about making the link between improvisation and psychotherapy, and I thought it was a really intriguing idea. And I thought it would be fun to figure out what were the connections. And it made me think when Freud didn't give much advice to early clinicians, when he was writing, he wrote loads of stuff that was, some things were totally brilliant and some things now look at were whoa, where were you going? But he only gave limited advice to beginning therapists. And one of the most important things that he said was that you should have what he called evenly hovering or evenly suspended attention, so that you should listen, but not make an immediate judgment and let things wash over you. And he felt like that was one of the most important things, because it would lead to new ways of thinking about things, new ways of feelings about things, so you wouldn't just confirm what you already knew. And in a way, I think he was helping you to listen almost like a musician, and then to be able to improvise better.
Mm-hmm.
And the funny thing is, the only thing that he really said the patient should do is that they should should try and free associate and not censor as much as they possibly could. And so when I thought about like how therapy started, it really started as a game of improvisation, and to be noticing of how we can improvise more and what are the blockages that get in the way of that improvisation. And I thought it was a cool idea to think that Freud was a jazz guy, like he didn't really he didn't think of himself as that way at all. And I'm sure I don't even know if he knew much about jazz, but in a lot of ways, I thought that was an interesting way of thinking about it too, that we could look at the psyche and the way the psyche works as this elaborate improvisation.
Yeah, cool. That's definitely kind of an interesting connection that I know you brought up a little bit earlier, but kind of the more you talk about it, the more it makes sense. And also I feel like, for me at least, if you think of, I don't know, kind of like the stereotype for psychologists, just like a sit down therapist kind of person, like you definitely have to have like those skills there. Like it's just one like giant conversation. Like, yes, they have knowledge that they can kind of impart on you, but it's just a conversation. Like, you just kind of have to go with it. You can't just,
you have to go back and forth. And the other thing that I hear from a lot of clients who, sometimes been with other therapists, is that I either feel like people have, like, if they've had bad experiences, like they've either had one or two experiences, right? Either they've had a therapist who doesn't listen that well and gives them a lot of advice, or doesn't allow them to kind of space to kind of open things up for new territory, and is quick to either jump in or quick to say, yeah, that's not as important, this is important. Mm-hmm. Or they have a therapist who is very like listening and doesn't give that much feedback and feels like, well, I don't know what to do with all this stuff. And I think a good jazz improviser, like a good therapist, is somebody who listens a lot and then will almost echo what other musicians are playing, but still make it their own so that they can find something new, which inspires the other musician to take that and make something new again, and back and forth. And I think it's this kind of paradoxical combination of working with something old, but finding something new and doing it together, back and forth and back and forth and back and forth. Mm-hmm. And that's the sort of collaboration that I actually also think makes our careers so fulfilling. If we can think of our career work as looking for good improvisational partners, right? Whether it's with our colleagues or with our mentors or with our bosses, that we're looking for who has range to improvise well. Mm-hmm. And I think that's a more fruitful way of looking at it, rather than, in my field in psychology, and a lot of people in the public think, well, we just deal with problems, or disorders. In fact, I had an old supervisor who joked that the DSM should be called the damn stupid manual, because it only cataloged problems, but it didn't really talk about possibilities and context. Mm-hmm. Yeah. And improvisation is all about context.
Definitely. I know I've been saying this throughout, this whole podcast, but like that analogy that you did between like kind of like jazz and that improvisation versus like psychological improvisation, that was just a very like cool analogy, because I feel like it goes like a lot deeper than you might just, if you, like you just saying it. I feel like you kind of dove into it and explained it a little bit, and it definitely has a lot of different like connections that you might not realize at first. So that was pretty interesting.
There's another metaphor that I think you might like too, because some people have a hard time visualizing a music metaphor. Mm-hmm. But Walt Whitman, the great poet, said, mm-hmm. "Do I contradict myself? Very well then. I am large. I contain multitudes." All of us contain multitudes. And if you can imagine, we have a table set before us. We have all different selves sitting at that table. And there are some who have this side of the story. They're sad, or they're angry, or they're proud. And we all have multiple selves, though we think we are one. We are one, and to echo the poet Pablo Neruda, we are many. And the challenge is, which one am I being now? And how can I move fluidly between them in a way that is creative and interesting? And how, when I get disconnected from other sides that are important, where do they go? And how can I find them again? Mm-hmm. And I think, even when thinking about career, I think sometimes we think of career only with the one self. Maybe the one self that we feel is our most dominant self, the self that we feel most confident in. I'm hardworking, or I'm smart, or I'm this, and that's the career. But what about the other sides? How do they feel about the possible career?
Yeah.
And I think that it's important to see that, like Walt Whitman said, that we are multitudes. And we are taught, though, to think that we are one self.
Mm-hmm.
And we are. But it's like, the funny thing about film is a wonderful illusion, because what film is stills, picture stills. And the picture stills that we see on a flat screen give us the illusion of movement and dynamic motion. And that's what's called animation. And the funny thing is, we are stills as well. We are all kind of, and the fluidity that we see is moving between those different sides. And it takes skill of learning how that works, and also learning when that breaks down. I sometimes joke with people that the way we're built is like a car. And we're like an automatic car. And when we're working well, we don't even notice that the gears are shifting. But usually when it breaks down like a manual car is when we realize, oh, there are different gears.
Yeah. Yeah.
So I think that's also important for us with career, because there are many different sides of ourselves that are important in figuring out what career works for us and what parts of the career don't work for us, and how to figure out what's the right match.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that is a really, really great metaphor. So thank you for sharing. I also love the fact that you have just like poems that you can just like recite and just like.
That's my mom speaking. Yes, that's my mom. Yeah.
Gotcha. That's very cool though. It's definitely, I mean, it's got some good advice in there. So, it's definitely very useful.
The poets usually do. Freud said, everywhere I go, the poet has been there before me. So.
Yep. Exactly. I wanted to shift gears a little bit again and talk about the Mentor Project and kind of the experience that you've had there and what being a mentor means to you.
Oh, yeah. I mean, one of the things I love about the Mentor Project is that you get to meet other mentors and learn from each other. And, Debbie Heiser has been a sort of mentor for me as well. We rediscovered each other. We went to grad school together and we didn't realize.
Oh,
and
cool.
So we actually became mentors without realizing it, that I was interested in the sorts of talks that she was doing, and she was interested in the writing and the TED Talk that I did, and we sort of co-mentored each other. And then, when she introduced me to the people at the Mentor Project, it's so cool to talk. I think, the thing that's so cool about being a mentor is that I think you learn more as a teacher than you do almost as a student. Mm-hmm. And I think the greatest students are teachers, and the greatest teachers are students.
Yeah.
And I think when we can kind of be in that place where there's that kind of fluidity and flexibility between those is when we're having the most fun, and actually when we're learning the most. And again, I think what I love about the Mentor Project is that it celebrates that way of relating to all the fields under the sun, science, technology, the arts, health and medicine, and you name it, and teaching and education. And I think the more that we can see this kind of cross-pollination and interplay between things, whereas we're all teachers and students at the same time, it's just a wonderful vibe.
Yeah. I kind of like that you mentioned that you and Debbie almost like co-mentored each other, because I feel like there's a very large stereotype almost in mentoring that the mentor is like older and like has had way more years, like a lot more experience, and then the mentee is like super young and stuff. But I also know that of all the mentors I've talked to, there have been quite a few who are like, it's very much a two-way street, and it's very much like mentoring can go in all different directions. It's not like super direct in like one sense,
Yeah, and you know who taught me about that?
Who?
Debbie taught me, actually, because she has this lovely concept of lateral mentoring, which I had never heard of before. And the idea of lateral mentoring, you're right, is like goes against the traditional mentoring, which is mentoring should be from someone who's older and more experienced to someone who's younger and less experienced, which is typically how we think of mentoring. But lateral mentoring means that there could be someone who's of similar age, but they might be in a different subdiscipline or might have a different set of experiences or skills, and they help you, and then maybe you help them. And I think what's exciting about that is that it's a real it's a real sharing in a different kind of way. And I actually think even the best traditional mentor relationship, like where are my hands? There they are. From over here, I think a traditional mentor, as it develops, becomes more of a lateral mentorship.
Yeah. Yeah.
And I think that's what's really fun. And that's one of the reasons why I wanted to write my book, is also to say that being a supervisor, being a teacher, enabled me to be a better student of psychotherapy. And I love the process of mentoring because I've learned so much from that. And I think that's what makes the field get more and more interesting.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I can definitely understand that. I can see that. It seems that we're almost out of time, but I have a couple things left. So my first one is, if there's anybody who's listening or watching right now and wants to learn more about you or get in touch with you, what would be the best way for them to do that?
Yeah, so probably the best way is, my website is michaelalcee.com. So It's easy to find me and all the things that I'm doing, whether it's therapy or I do supervision for young therapists and early career clinicians as well.
Okay.
I also have this organization that I've run with a friend, Chris Willard. We help other therapists who are interested in getting their blog or book ideas out there or doing their TEDx talks. I like coaching people on TEDx talks because it's a fun process.
Mm-hmm.
And the easiest way also is to email me, drmichaelalcee@gmail.com. Dr, no period, drmichaelalcee@gmail.com.
Okay.
And my TEDx talk is on introverts, of all things, which we didn't talk about much, but is another fun, intriguing topic. So you can always Google my TEDx talk and check that out too.
Okay. I definitely will. That's interesting. And for as for your Gmail and your website, I will go ahead and put them into the description of this podcast, just to make it a little bit easier for people, so they don't have to worry about spelling and stuff.
Yeah, that's much easier.
Yeah, definitely. Okay, so my last thing is, I have a couple quote unquote rapid fire questions for you.
Yeah.
Because I know you mentioned this, and I like to say this in all of the podcasts.
Is this going to be like the Colbert questionnaire?
Yes, actually, yes, perfect. a little bit. I
love it. Apple.
But no, I kind of put this in here because I know you said this at one point, and I like to say that it's important to know your mentor as a well-rounded person and not just their job. So that's kind of what inspired this. But anyway, my first question is your favorite book, or just one that comes to mind.
Oh my gosh, To Kill a Mockingbird. To Kill a Mockingbird. Atticus Finch is my favorite character in all of American literature.
Wow.
I'm really excited that he's actually being portrayed by Jeff Daniels right now on Broadway, and he actually takes Atticus in a little bit of a new direction, but he's just such an interesting character with a lot of dimension, and that story is just such a beautiful, compelling story. Yeah,
I definitely agree. I mean, I was in, it's kind of like your basic English book that you have to read, so I read it as well, and I definitely can understand why you feel that way about him.
And, it goes to show you, too, Harper Lee only wrote one major book in her lifetime, and that's all she needed.
Yeah. You're very correct. Yep.
Right.
Yeah, now that you mention it, yeah. My second question for you is, which I kind of already know the answer, but do you play any instruments?
Oh, right. So, I play piano, I play classical and some jazz, and I pretend to play guitar. But and what's great about having an instrument or having an art, whether it's music or painting or writing, is it's a really good way to balance out our careers. There would be times when, for my lunch break during working at a college, I would go to a piano room or practice room and play. And I really think it's a really wonderful way to make sure that you keep your instrument tuned as well, no matter what you do, whether you're a Wall Street broker or a scientist or an engineer. I think having an artistic outlet is extremely important for balance.
Yeah. I'm going to relate this back to me for a second. But I actually play the harp. I've played.
It's a beautiful instrument. Yeah,
it is. I've played for 8 years, and it definitely I've always enjoyed playing it, but I've never liked practicing. So it was always a big pain for my parents. They were like, come on, at least you got to practice. But I'm finally gotten to the age where I do tend to enjoy practice, even if it's difficult for me, Yeah. So I definitely know what you mean. But My
That's
third
great.
question for you, is how do you spend your time off and away from work?
Yeah, for me, it's a mixture. So one of the things I like about my work structure is I can see clients and then I can go mow the lawn.
Yeah,
Or,
yeah,
or then I'll go write an article or work on the book or play with my 3-year-old son, or go play golf or go skiing or something like that. So for me, variety is what it's all about.
yeah,
And so I think like I'm somebody who likes to walk a lot. So especially over the pandemic, I've done a lot of walking. I've done a lot of walking sessions, believe it or not.
yeah,
I've even met people and done walking sessions. So I like just finding places, interesting places, because I live in the Westchester area, which is like on the Hudson Valley. So there's
yeah.
lovely places to walk along the river. And so for me, finding new spots to walk and discover are great. But yeah, for me, it's a combination of mixing it up.
Gotcha. Good to know. But yeah, I tend to agree with like the whole like walking pandemic thing. My family has gone on so many walks.
More steps than I've ever done in my life.
Yeah. My fourth and final question for you is, what is your favorite movie franchise? Or if you don't have one that stands out, just movie is fine too.
Oh, movie. That's a really good one. Man. Oh, that's a doozy. Movie franchise or movie?
I feel like anytime I ask this question, which also it's the same if anybody were to ask this question to me, just like every movie I've ever watched just leaves my head. And I'm like, I don't know.
Exactly. There's one movie I there's so many movies that I really love, for different reasons. But I'm thinking when I wrote my book, I wrote about 2 movies in particular that had a big impact on me, obviously because of therapy. And I loved Good Will Hunting.
Yeah, that's a good one.
For the therapy and the beautiful writing. And I also liked Little Miss Sunshine, which I thought was a charming film about family and the kind of dysfunctional beauty that all families have in them.
Yeah.
And I think those movies particularly stand out for me. And I know there's another one because, it's going to come to me when we finish talking.
Yeah.
But there was actually, here's another one. There's a beautiful French movie named Amélie. And Amélie was a movie about this very introverted girl who had this wonderful imagination. And what I loved about this movie is that it showcased how rich our inner world is. And it's this fun mystery and it's very playful. And I think it really kind of gets at how fun and interesting the inner world is. So that's one of my favorites too.
Yeah, those are good. Out of those 3, I've only seen Good Will Hunting, but I am familiar with the other 2. But I definitely can kind of understand the perspectives that you have on them. So.
There's a lot of good stuff out there. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, so like that was all that I had for you, Michael. But I am really, really glad that we were able to like make this work today.
Yeah, we pulled this off. This was great to do.
Yeah, it was. Yeah.
I learned so much from your questions. So thank you for such wonderful, inviting, intriguing questions. That's what I'm saying. You learned so much from each other. So this is a pleasure. I'm excited.
No, thank you. Yeah. To anyone who's like watching or listening in right now, like, thank you guys so much for tuning in. I hope you all found that really interesting and are able to take something away from it. Now, obviously, again, if you want to learn more about Michael, feel free to go to the places he mentioned, which I will put in the description. And if you want to learn more about me or the Mentor Project itself, feel free to go to mentorproject.org, which I will also put in the description. So I hope to see all of you back here next week. And once again, thank you so much to our sponsors for making this podcast possible. And thank you to our listeners. And thank you for helping us keep this podcast going. So, Michael, thank you so much. And I hope everyone has a great week.